I'm Roger Baker, Executive Director of the Stratfor Center for Applied Geopolitics at RANE, a global center of excellence for geopolitical intelligence and analysis. Learn how you can put geopolitics to work for your organization at ranenetwork.com.
Israel and Hezbollah stand on the brink. Since October 7, 2023, Hezbollah, in solidarity with the Palestinian militant group Hamas, has launched thousands of attacks on northern Israel, prompting an Israeli military response. But what are the deeper drivers of this conflict? How might it evolve in this current phase, and where might it go, both in the near and far future? I'm joined today by senior Middle East analyst Ryan Bohl and security analyst Freddy Khoueiry to understand the deeper geopolitics of this long-standing conflict. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having us, Emma.
Happy to be here.
To give some background, Israel and Lebanon have technically been at war since 1948, when the newly independent state of Lebanon joined in the Pan-Arab campaign against Israel. No treaty was ever signed between the two, and for decades, Lebanon hosted Palestinian militant groups like the Palestinian Liberation Organization that conducted guerrilla warfare against Israel's north. But internal divisions inside Lebanon soon sidelined the country in the Pan-Arab struggle against Israel, and it sat out the 1967 and 1973 wars before Lebanon itself collapsed into a civil war in 1975. During that civil war, Israel invaded Lebanon to root out the PLO in 1982, an invasion that, while successfully pushing the PLO to relocate to Tunisia, also sparked a popular counter-reaction in Lebanon that led to the formation of the militant movement Hezbollah. Hezbollah, sponsored by revolutionary Iran, dedicated itself to confrontation with Israel as part of its ideological charter, a charter it maintains to this day. So, Ryan, how does that lead us to kind of where we are today?
So I think we can start with 1982 and the buffer zone that Israel established there, because we're seeing a little bit of a repeat of history here. The Israelis are saying they want a new buffer zone in southern Lebanon in order to prevent, essentially guerrilla attacks similar to the ones that they faced from the Palestinians back in the 50s and 60s and 70s. And the thing is that Israel has tried this strategy before, where they carved out a buffer zone for 18 years that went all the way to a river called the Litani River in southern Lebanon, which was kind of a natural geographic boundary. And the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces, were stuck there for almost 2 decades. And they were stuck in a guerrilla war against not just Hezbollah, but also localized Lebanese militants, different groups and criminal clans. They ended up having to govern this portion of southern Lebanon in a way that they really had no interest politically or strategically in doing so. They tried to set up this organization called the South Lebanese Army, the SLA, which was a proxy force made up of essentially Lebanese collaborators. But this force only functioned so long as the IDF was around to prop it up and provide income for it. And so when Israel in the 90s had started to turn sour on this buffer zone, they started to see it as this open-ended conflict that they couldn't afford economically, politically, diplomatically. It made them look like an aggressor power regionally, and they were coming up against Western opposition, especially American opposition to this continued occupation. And so they tried to stand up the SLA as a force that would protect the buffer zone and keep Hezbollah and other pro-Iranian militants and Palestinian militants out of the buffer zone. But of course, as often happens, as soon as Israel withdrew in 2000 and left behind the SLA to try to stand them up, similar to the American experience in Afghanistan, this force collapsed almost overnight. And this taught the Israelis a certain lesson, which is, one, they can't find any proxies in Lebanon that are going to be effective in securing a buffer zone. The other thing that it taught them is that, especially for Israeli politicians, is that creating a buffer zone in southern Lebanon is a trickier task than might be presupposed, given Israel's conventional military superiority. Like, Israel drove all the way to Beirut in 1982 and was able to even fight with the Syrian army and won successfully some skirmishes against them. The military problem the military challenge is not the problem for the Israelis. It's the political problem that comes with victory afterwards. And so Israeli politicians are right now scratching their heads as how do we avoid repeating this history? Yes, the Israelis could drive across the southern Lebanese border and they could push Hezbollah out of those territories, but how do they keep themselves from getting trapped in the same kind of conflict that they already fought in the 80s and 90s? So then, Freddy, that kind of leads us to what Hezbollah's position was. Both during the guerrilla war against the Israelis, after the civil war, and of course the war in 2006. So, lay out that narrative for us. Like, how has Hezbollah reacted to Israeli pressure over time?
Certainly. So, just to provide a brief background of the period between the 2000s until 2006, which we've seen in Lebanon and in the wider region, a couple of instances that helped create the sort of environment for another war in Lebanon between Hezbollah and Israel. Basically, after what the Lebanese commemorate as liberation in 2000, when Hezbollah rooted out Israel's army with its proxy, the SLA, we've had sort of like a war of attrition, not in the immediate sense as the attrition we know, but sporadic rocket attacks by Hezbollah, some tit-for-tat clashes, certain limited Israeli airstrikes, incursions, trying to kidnap Hezbollah fighters trying to ambush IDF patrols on their shared border. And then we had all of these sort of like geopolitical developments at the side. We had the war in Iraq in 2003. We've had the fact that Syria did not support that war, did not support the US. So the US basically was pressuring the Syrians to exit Lebanon, which led us to the March 14 kind of protests, which then forced Hezbollah's ally Syria out of the country. And then in 2006, we were at an inflection point. Basically in July, early July, Hezbollah launched one of its numerous sporadic ambush attacks against an IDF patrol, killing 3 soldiers and kidnapping a couple of others. Now, here is where Hezbollah miscalculated. It's in the fact that they did not estimate Israel's resolve to be another Lebanon war. And basically the Israelis, supported by the US, launched sort of like a campaign against Lebanon to try to root out Hezbollah. This was sort of like an air campaign, but also involved a lot of ground incursions, which were mostly for the Israelis and per the Israeli military analysts as well as military personnel, was unsuccessful because they weren't able to root out pockets of Hezbollah fighters who had sort of like a decentralized chain of commands and were able to stand their grounds. So the fighting took over a month, 34 days of fighting. Israel destroyed a large proportion of Lebanon's infrastructure. Hezbollah was able to inflict damage to Israel's economy, to Israeli civilians, attacking Haifa. But back then, Hezbollah was not the formidable sort of like conventional non-state actor we see today. Hezbollah was largely depending on rocket fire, mainly Katyushas and Grads, sort of these short-range rockets, but that overwhelm Israeli defenses. And they relied on their own military personnel, ATGMs, relying on their geography, rugged southern Lebanon terrain, dense forests, steep mountains, rocky mountains, and so on. So the conflict eventually was achieved with what we call as UNSC 1701, which is a UN Security Council resolution stipulating the end of hostilities, which was almost like a stalemate. Even though both sides claimed victory, later on we know that the Israelis weren't satisfied with their performance, and Hezbollah, on the other hand, was able to domestically exploit their victory and were able to claim that victory. So this stalemate led to the entrenchment of Hezbollah not only as a military parallel to the Lebanese state, but also as a political powerhouse. And we've seen the ascension ever since. But at the same time, in military terms, UNSC 1701 set up kind of the buffer zone that Israel is looking for currently in the current dynamics. But it didn't hold much. It didn't hold very long. To be clear, so Hezbollah was able to maintain its presence in the south, was able to build up its arsenal, and since then was entrenched in Lebanese politics. Now, since 2006 and since the end of the July War or the Second Lebanon War and the subsequent stalemate, Hezbollah sees that this date was the date that established the current deterrent that exists, and that the war in 2006 and the subsequent Hezbollah development prevented another Israeli war against Lebanon. Basically, during the next couple of years, until the 2008s, we've had a lot of sort of we were back to the status quo of sort of Israeli strikes on a couple of Hezbollah operatives. They killed Hezbollah's most significant commander in Syria, Moghniye. We've also had a couple of attacks by Hezbollah, sporadic rocket attacks, and so on. Now, this leads us to the early 2010s. And that is where we've had the kind of Syrian revolution. Then it spiraled out into the Syrian civil war. Initially, Hezbollah did not intervene in the Syrian war. But when the several armed factions involved in the Syrian civil war started to gain ground and take ground from the Syrian regime, then Hezbollah started to intervene. I think Hezbollah was rumored to have intervened back in 2000 and as early as 2012. But Hezbollah publicly acknowledged its presence in Syria in 2013, and then they deepened their commitment on the ground. So initially, from the beginning, Hezbollah's role was not to rebuild or reinforce regime forces or help them rebuild their own capacities. No, they were there to establish parallel institutions, such as the pro-regime militias, some of which we still see operating in Syria now. So from the onset, Hezbollah was in Syria to remain entrenched there, because we know Syria is arguably one of the most important lifelines for Hezbollah, because this is the transit route from which Iran supplies the group with weapons and maintains its sort of like axis of resistance and supports its militias in Iraq, but also in Syria and in Lebanon. So this evolved. Hezbollah's strategy and their arguments for their intervention in Syria evolved, because we've had a lot of domestic backlash. We had a lot of sectarian clashes inside of Lebanon, terrorist attacks. So eventually, Hezbollah said that they were there because they saw an existential threat, not only to Hezbollah, but to Lebanon's Shia population, but also to the whole country, because we've had sort of these sectarian clashes, because we saw the rise of Islamism in Lebanon, and so on, and because we saw pockets of jihadi groups such as Al-Nusra or ISIS, with that said, having pockets and controlling a couple of Lebanese border villages on the borders with Syria, which prompted a couple of operations in which Hezbollah coordinated with the Lebanese armed forces and the Syrian armed forces to root out these jihadi terrorists from the borderlands between Lebanon and Syria. Since then, we're back to the status quo. Hezbollah is now entrenched in Syria. Iran is growing its influence there, despite the regime regaining some of its relative strength and controlling most swaths of relative Syrian territory. But we still have this entrenchment. We still have them operating. They have warehouses. They have stockpiles. They store large quantities of ammunition there, given its wide geography, and they operate in Syria. And so Syria has since then become another theater from which Hezbollah and Iran and pro-Iranian militias could harass Israel from.
This relationship changed on October 7th. It's still not clear to what extent Hezbollah knew of the impending Hamas attack on Israel. Some sources suggest they were at least partially informed something was coming, but what is clear is that Hezbollah deliberately chose to strike Israel without provoking another 2006-style war. For Hezbollah, the status quo was acceptable, in which Hezbollah and Israel limited their operations against one another, and both sides used the conflict for their political ends. But for Israel, after the shock of October 7th, the status quo could no longer be tolerated, and Israeli leaders talked about rebuilding the former buffer zone in Lebanon more and more, until on June 18th, the IDF approved operational plans to resume the war in Lebanon. Let's start with Hezbollah's intentions. Freddy, what are the major drivers and constraints informing Hezbollah's current positioning?
Yeah, so this is a very interesting question, Emma and Brian. We've had numerous discussions on these. So this evolved. The drivers for Hezbollah's intervention in support of Hamas evolved. Initially, Hezbollah entered the conflict in support of Hamas, first to pressure the Israelis and divert some of its military resources away from Gaza to give a lifeline to Hamas to be able to resist. And we could argue that partially this kind of worked because 9 months into the Gaza war, we still have this insurgency. We still have a couple of thousands of Hamas fighters dug into their tunnel networks, even though the Israelis largely degraded their military capabilities and their rocket launching abilities. So at the same time, domestically, Hezbollah's intervention upholds one of its key arguments and arguments of its existence as a military component inside of Lebanon, which is to help the Palestinians with their cause. In some as being sort of like a resistance not only to Israeli aggression against Lebanon, but also against the Palestinians. And this shows Hezbollah supporters that the group is keen on keeping their word of support and are able to take the war to Israel. This is very symbolic to them, given the asymmetry and the difference in capabilities. Intent here is very symbolic and is very important. But it's also aimed at increasing its popularity domestically. Especially via what I just described, given that the past few years in Lebanon have been dire politically and economically with multiple crises, and Hezbollah played a large part in these perceived failures and crises. So initially, now we take it to a regional level, Hezbollah was trying to maintain deterrence against, and is still trying to maintain deterrence against Israel. First, within the regional unity of the fields strategy, in which the members of the Axis of Resistance in Syria, Yemen, Iraq, and elsewhere surround Israel and its allies and coordinate their attacks and networks and movements as part of the Axis of Resistance, sort of like to showcase that they're present in a lot of fields and that they can surround the Israelis and their allies and that they can inflict damage. Secondly, Hezbollah is trying to deter Israel through its own capabilities, not only through the capabilities of the wider axis of resistance, because Hezbollah acquired a large arsenal of weapons, which we will talk about in a bit. They wanted to deter Israel through preempting potential Israeli offensive in Lebanon, which the group itself assesses would have been the next Israeli move after Gaza, if they did not, if they did not intervene in the first place. Now, this is debatable and there's room for argument, but that is what the group assesses. So, as the conflict evolved and the war in Gaza extended and we're still in this phase, Israel and Hezbollah both expressed their preference for an eventual negotiated settlement on the border, which Hezbollah would definitely want, but would want to impose their own concessions and will not budge. And the Israelis also want their own concessions, which Hezbollah will not concede to. So this is another driver for Hezbollah, is to impose sort of these concessions in any diplomatic settlement with Israel, sort of like what happened with the maritime border settlement or agreement of 2022, in which Hezbollah was able to frame some of it and to make it seem as a strategic win for the Lebanese population. But additionally, Hezbollah's main driver also became to return to the status quo that existed before the October 7 war, which is what I discussed in the aftermath of the 2006 war, which is kind of like the deterrent that prevented Israel from launching another major war against Lebanon, which is what Hezbollah calls as balance of fear or balance of terror. This was from 2006 until recently. To the group, it prevented any Israeli assault on Lebanon. It's sort of like a mutual assert destruction kind of doctrine where Hezbollah showcases their largely acquired capabilities and that they're able to inflict damage to the Israelis, especially should the Israelis think of launching a wider war against Lebanon. So now that we have sort of these drivers aside, I can talk about some of the constraints, because Hezbollah did not engage fully in the war, and they've received a lot of criticism for not seizing this chance. But initially, one of the main constraints was the fact that they were likely unaware of the surprise attack initiated by Hamas, as were the rest of the axis of resistance, including Iran, for that matter. Thus, the group was basically not ready and likely did not want to suffer the consequences of Israeli repercussions or retaliation if they had fully initiated war with Israel. This also brings us to a second constraint, which is that domestically, even though Hezbollah is dominant as a political actor, they preferred not to initiate a full war to avert being seen domestically as an aggressor and dragging Lebanon to another war that a large portion of the Lebanese consider has nothing to do with them, especially with what's happened in the past few years. Though either way, there are a lot of Lebanese officials and people that express their disdain for this limited kind of clash between Israel and Hezbollah, and they consider that eventually this will lead to an Israeli war against Lebanon, or a destructive one. The numbers would have been greater if Hezbollah had been the one initiating a wider war against Israel. And speaking of status of aggressor, Hezbollah also did not want to be seen as an aggressor regionally, because in a defensive war, Hezbollah could garner much more leverage and support, and Iran, for one, prefers not to be dragged in a wider war that could prove devastating to Iran itself, but also its proxy forces, and drag all of these Western allies of Israel. Having a defensive kind of war, kind of assuming the responsibility of defending your own territories, of defending the Palestinians, of supporting them, sort of gives you more support nationally, but also regionally.
Ryan, can you speak a little bit on Israel's side of things and what the major drivers and constraints are for them?
Yeah, absolutely. And we already touched on some of this, that Israel's major driver is the creation of a security zone that would prevent an October 7th style assault on northern Israel. October 7th showed to Israel, and probably has permanently socialized an entire generation of Israelis, that without physical security, deterrence is insufficient. That you can't just create these operational dynamics in which you attack the militants every once in a while, they attack back, they stick within the paradigms of trying to avoid overt escalation and dragging themselves into a war. They have concluded that these ideological groups like Hezbollah, like Hamas, have this charter where they have to attack Israel, and eventually that charter will drag them towards major escalations that don't necessarily make a whole lot of strategic sense. Hamas's assault on October 7th only makes sense through a political and ideological logic rather than a security or economic. Even on the political front, to a certain extent, Hamas has been given a substantial setback by carrying out this attack. But ideologically, it made perfect sense. And Hezbollah is now being seen in that same sort of actor's prism, that they are an ideological group dedicated to attacking and destroying Israel, and that one day, whether it's now, 10 years, 20 years, they're going to carry out a mass invasion of northern Israel. And if that happens, then it is a major security threat to the Israelis. And so that is one of the major drivers, is that their assumptions of Hezbollah's behavior have been permanently reframed by Hamas's attack on October 7th. So they assume that it's no longer a question of if, but when Hezbollah decides to try to carry out a similar style assault. And so that drives them to the creation of this buffer zone, because the buffer zone would buy the IDF time in case such a buildup or an incursion began. It wouldn't necessarily prevent an incursion, but it would give the IDF some strategic space to respond to it, to allow institutions to snap into place to defeat such a massed incursion or a massed invasion if it ever did come to take place. Now, the constraints, of course, are the same constraints that have prevented Israel from carrying out another attempt to eradicate Hezbollah for the past nearly 20 years. In 2006, Israel said it was going to dismantle Hezbollah. It was unsuccessful in doing so. That has been part of the assumption of the IDF for many years, is that Hezbollah is too large, too well entrenched amongst Lebanese Shia. It is too well supplied by the Iranians, and that Lebanon itself is a country of it's large enough geographic space that no Israeli campaign will ever be capable of eradicating Hezbollah. And so while Israel doesn't seek to destroy Hezbollah, in this case, it does recognize that it's going to be facing a formidable fighting force, and that it is very possible that Hezbollah moves back into an insurgency or guerrilla-style campaign against Israel's buffer zone that leaves that buffer zone more or less an open conflict area that results in a trickle of Israeli casualties, and a great deal of national treasuries is being utilized to protect that area in the north. And that's a major constraint to this strategy. Israel feels compelled to create a buffer zone, but is aware that it will be imperfect and is aware that it will cost both blood and treasure on a level that might not be politically sustainable, particularly if this is going to be a permanent state of affairs. If we're looking at Israel controlling a strip of southern Lebanon for the next 20 or 50 years, that is something that will have to survive multiple Israeli governments that will come and go, and full generations that haven't even been born yet and aren't voting and may not have the same opinions about the buffer zone as the generations that are alive today. The other major constraints, of course, are regional and diplomatic, because if Israel moves into southern Lebanon, it creates the prospect that the conflict could spread. Almost assuredly, Iran's proxies will get involved in an escalated capacity against Israel, but they may also decide to strike the United States, which is Israel's primary arms supplier and close ally in the region. They may also decide to start expanding their attacks to the Mediterranean, to shipping there, similar as the Houthis already have with the Red Sea. So we have the proxy escalation that seems relatively reasonable to assume is going to happen in case of an Israeli incursion or invasion of southern Lebanon. But we also have the prospect that Iran, having struck Israel itself in 2024, in April of 2024, will also decide to repeat that sort of strategy. Because what we learned through that is that Iran can not only attack Israel directly, but they can reshape some aspects of Israeli behavior by doing so, even as Iran doesn't want a full-scale war that's open-ended. Using those sorts of barrages can signal to Israel and the United States and the region that Israel's hawkish behavior needs to reframe itself or take a step back. After all, we haven't seen the Israelis carry out the level of a high-profile assassination against an Iranian leader at the scale of their embassy attack in Damascus in April of 2024. We haven't seen the Israelis repeat that since then, because they've now, a new deterrence has been reestablished that helps the Iranians secure their interests. So the Iranians could also very well get involved and fire another barrage at Israel, and in the most extreme cases at U.S. forces within the region. All of that is a prospect that creates pressure on Israel from the West, and primarily from the United States, to limit how far it goes in Lebanon. And that's a problem for the Israelis too, because if they have a limited ground incursion into southern Lebanon, that still concede tactical advantages to Hezbollah. If Hezbollah knows that there are zones that Israel can't move into, or is hesitant to strike, or is hesitant to send in troops, they'll use those as safe zones in order to organize and carry out attacks, and that is a problem for the Israelis. So there's all of these constraints to Israel's willingness to carry out this campaign, but that fervor that was unleashed after October 7th is strong enough that right now I think Israel is compelled to move into a buffer zone that it knows will be incomplete and imperfect and will involve high diplomatic costs and potential regional destabilization, because Israel, at the end of the day, believes it can put up with all of those constraints, because the potential future assaults of another October 7th on northern Israel is just unacceptable.
So, Freddy, how has the conflict evolved on a tactical level, and what are the new methods that Hezbollah might leverage going forward?
So, the clashes on the borders between Israel and Lebanon with Hezbollah evolved in a very interesting way. It was very progressive. At first, Hezbollah made sure to only fire anti-tank guided precision missiles on Israeli positions at the border, while the Israelis were mostly responding with artillery fire, a couple of airstrikes here and there, but ultimately only on border communities from both sides. Then the Israelis started to expand sort of their targeting. They used more drones, more airstrikes, deepening a bit still within southern Lebanon, but striking cities that weren't struck first. Then in January, where we had sort of this transition to a more expansive conflict, the Israelis decided to kinetically assassinate arguably Hamas's number 2 guy, which is Saleh al-Aruri. Now, this was a message to Hezbollah back then because it struck Beirut, but it struck specifically a Hamas official, which did not prompt Hezbollah to strike sort of a major Israeli city. What Hezbollah did was they started to showcase that they have intelligence on Israel's strategic military assets, bases, headquarters, command bases, and so on. So they struck the Mount Meron air surveillance base, from which coordinates sort of Israel's air activity over Lebanon with dozens of Katyusha rockets. Now, this is how it started to evolve. Whenever Israel was to strike a significant target inside of Lebanon, maybe a Hezbollah operative, someone who's senior, maybe a new geography, sort of deepening their strike, Hezbollah was at first specifically retaliating with large barrages of unguided Katyusha rockets, sort of to send a message, overwhelm Israeli air defenses, and so on. But since then, it seems Hezbollah saw that this wasn't enough to deter the Israelis. So progressively, we started seeing the use of heavier rockets. For example, the Volcano or Barkan rockets, which is a short-range ballistic missile, heavily loaded, that can cause a lot of damage, although it's unguided. We've seen the Falak 1 and Falak 2, which are 2 Iranian-made rockets that have significant payload. They have heavy explosive payloads. We saw Hezbollah now using a combined sort of tactic, sort of like we've seen in 2006, but with more capabilities, launching a couple of rockets as a diversion for Israeli air defenses, then launching suicide drones on their targets. And we've seen Hezbollah become more precise, more accurate, and even more lethal. And then we've had at the same time an Israeli escalation. The Israelis started to target areas near Sidon, deeper in the south. We've seen a target Hezbollah stronghold of the Bekaa Valley. Just a couple of hours ago, we've had another drone strike in the Bekaa. Yesterday, we've had a strike on a symbolic city, which is Nabatiya, deeper in the south. At the same time, Hezbollah also started to deepen its geographic targeting Safed, Tiberias, Nahariya, and Acre. Basically, we're still in an ever-evolving sort of tactical situation where Hezbollah progressively starts to use its more advanced weapons to showcase their capabilities and to use them in parallel with psychological warfare to try to deter an Israeli attack. We've also seen Hezbollah use medium-range anti-air defenses, such as the Sayyad 2C, which is a medium-range SAM system, which is advanced for a non-state actor. So we could see that Hezbollah is symbolically and progressively trying to escalate things to deter the Israelis, to prevent the Israeli Air Force from operating with ease over Lebanon. We've seen Hezbollah down at least 4 or 5 Hermes 900 drones, which is arguably one of Israel's most advanced drones, and 5 of a fleet of a couple of dozens, which is significant. From Israel's perspective, this isn't deterring them from deciding whether to launch a war or not, at least until now. It's sort of making them target Hezbollah even more at this point, for the reasons that Ryan laid out, some of the drivers that Ryan laid out, but there are also some constraints that also Ryan and I both laid out, both from Hezbollah and Israel. So there's this risk of miscalculation that might eventually spiral out into an all-out war, because tactically the two sides will continue to escalate on a progressive basis, introducing newer, more advanced, and more lethal weapons.
So no conflict can go on forever, as most conflicts do. This one will likely shift and evolve and potentially maybe even end. Where will it go from here? And is there any resolution that might be possible in the near or far-term future?
Yeah, I can start that off just that, our baseline scenario, which is that we'll see an Israeli operation and it'll be open-ended. But then when we think about this from 5 or 10 or 20 years down the line, it's very hard not to see a repeat of history, and that eventually Israel abandons this buffer zone, is unable to politically sustain it. Militarily, it's too high of a cost. And we go back to, it might not be the status quo ante of October 6, 2023. Hezbollah might be a great deal more hesitant to engage in attacks on Israel depending on how the campaign goes. But it's hard to see Israel being capable of keeping a buffer zone under the current conditions. This Israeli government won't last forever. It is the most far-right government in Israel's history, and it's far more hawkish as a result. But it will eventually, this too shall pass. The Netanyahu era will come to an end. And when it does, the next government's going to be stuck with this strategy crafted together by this government. And so when we think about that, like long term, it looks like some form or another Israel's going to have to accept that Hezbollah will continue to exist on its northern borders. So will Palestinian militants. They will look like they will continue to exist on the northern border unless Israel takes some really dramatic policy steps to diffuse the drivers of conflict. And, the core driver of conflict is that there's no Palestinian political process. Whether or not that involves a one-state solution in which Palestinians get, political rights within Israel, or it involves a two-state solution in which there is an Arab state next to the Israeli state, and they both have a treaty in which they no longer fight and they get along. Unless something like that comes along, the recurrent cycles of violence are inevitable. And then we just see Israel have to try to carve out another buffer zone in the future or come up with more devastating ways to deter Hezbollah and other Palestinian militants from attacking it. And we just end up with cycles of violence into the future. And that unfortunately does seem like the baseline. But Freddy, maybe you've got a different take or maybe a different angle to consider as to where this might go in the long term.
Yeah, it's very interesting because I do agree with most of what you said, especially long term. I do think, and I'd like to float the idea that there's still some room for a negotiated settlement, but I still do think that moving forward, a stalemate or a settlement or a diplomatic initiative on the grounds of UNSC 1701 will eventually be insufficient to hold this. Because, okay, we've seen the UNSC 1701 withhold a major conflict between Lebanon and Israel for the past, let's say, 18 years. But then we're at the point where it's boiling up again. We have the potential for a conflict, and this is actually our baseline scenario, given that a lot of contingent on the end of hostilities in Gaza, which we don't see now. So we're kind of in this recurring pattern of violence because of all of these, because of the presence of Hezbollah, because of its strength, because of the Israelis' insecurities that are now even more blatant given the Hamas's surprise attack in October 7. So I would just float it in a way or change it in a way that we might see, although it's a less likely scenario, we might see some form of a diplomatic settlement, sort of like brokered by the US, similar to what we've seen in 2022. But I would then frame it again to your point, Ryan, that it might not be enough for the long term. It might be enough for a couple of weeks, for a couple of years. But then if we have another crisis in the Middle East that involves Iran, that involves maybe an Iranian proxy elsewhere, maybe Yemen, maybe Iraq, then we might see these recurring patterns of violence and strategic imperatives make Hezbollah, for example, intervene here and there, or make the Israelis kind of try to deter Hezbollah by attacking Lebanon again itself. So we're at the point where they might have to coexist moving forward, but this coexistence won't be very peaceful for the long term. There will be sporadic violence, but we might not see the major war we might see now or we've seen in 2006, because there's always a need to pause things, because the damage is so great that you need to recuperate, reassess your strategies, maybe prefer a sort of like a diplomatic solution to try to craft something else. But eventually I do see, just like you do, I do see like a recurring pattern of violence, especially when we look at Israel's internal dynamics and Lebanon's internal dynamics. Sometimes the way to sort of like escape from these is to do something crazy, that is maybe launch a wider war, for example. So you have all of these things sort of coming together that contribute to this continuous pattern of violence.
And I want to throw out, just as a final thought here, like when we're thinking about really the long-term, deep future of how this might change in a substantial way. And I think the biggest way that Israel and Hezbollah might be forced to come to terms with one another is if their external sponsors have a change in their behavior. And so from the Israeli side, that would mean a United States that either can't or won't support Israel the way that it currently does. The can't could be because it's involved in a major war in Asia, and that the United States is so domestically divided that policy making becomes impossible, and support to Israel falls apart as a result of domestic unrest or domestic paralysis. And that would force the Israelis into a very conciliatory move if the United States, for whatever reason, was no longer able to maintain its current level of support. And for that matter, Hezbollah too. If Iran, a revolutionary government, inevitably moderates or has another form of uprisings and unrest that change its fundamental ideological nature, or even, as a lot of people kind of dream about within Israel, a Soviet Union style reform and collapse process that means that suddenly it's more of a democratic, kinder, gentler Iran. But if something like that ever did happen over the decades, it would mean that every single one of Iran's allies and proxies would have to reassess their own strategic imperatives and incentives. And while Hezbollah has plenty of legitimacy as a Lebanese power, it would not be able to maintain its military power without Iranian sponsorship. So if that ever changed too, that would put Hezbollah into a much more conciliatory mood. Now, of course, both of those are distant scenarios. Those are both things that would have to take place over many years with many different steps in between. But it isn't impossible to see the United States retrench from the Middle East in a substantial way. That we know that's an American goal. And we know that not every government lasts forever. The idea that Iran's revolutionary Islamist republic will be there all the way to the end of the century, it may not be the safest assumption to make, given what we know about history and how regimes come and go. So that might be another thing that years and years and years down the line, perhaps even when I'm retired and Freddy, you're an old man, that might be something that could cause a substantial break of the cycle, as if the external sponsors change their behavior.
Hopefully we'll be there to analyze this.
We'll see.
Well, this has been a super insightful overview of this conflict. Thanks for your time and analyses, Freddy and Ryan. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks again for having us, Emma.
Thanks. Thank you, Emma.
For more risk, insights, and analyses, visit ranenetwork.com, where you can learn more about our suite of risk intelligence products and solutions. That's RANE network.com. Thanks for listening.